What if the man the world mourned was someone his own household feared? It's a question no one wants to ask aloud, yet it lingers in the shadows of Brentwood mansions and whispered recollections. On the surface, Rob Reiner was everything a public figure should be: accomplished, respected, principled. A filmmaker whose name alone evoked laughter, empathy, and cultural influence. But behind the closed doors of his sprawling $13.5 million estate, according to one woman who served the family for years, a very different story unfolded, a story that might change everything we think we know about the Reiners. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. This woman, a former maid, has stepped forward not to vilify, not to sell a sensational memoir, but because she says the truth demanded it. And her truth is startling. She claims she witnessed a man who, in private, was controlling, manipulative, and at times cruel. She recounts moments of tension that escalated into emotional torment. She says she saw a child cry, not from punishment, not from mischief, but from fear, and then she saw that fear dismissed, redirected, blamed onto the mother. The stories she tells are not about one explosive moment. They are about a pattern, a repetition that, in her words, was impossible to ignore. Why speak now, years after these alleged behaviors? Because the narrative that the world has been fed, the narrative of Rob Reiner as a loving father and tragic victim, is incomplete, she says. The focus has been on the shocking ending, the deaths, the arrest, the headlines screaming murder and tragedy. But if her account is even partially accurate, the story that led to that ending is far more complicated and far more unsettling. From the moment the bodies of Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were discovered, the world recoiled. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner reported multiple sharp force injuries, and authorities quickly confirmed that their son, Nick Reiner, living in the guest house on the property, had been arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The headlines were immediate and brutal: filmmaker killed by son, Brentwood tragedy, Hollywood horror. Everyone was searching for motive, for clarity, for a face to blame. And for months, the narrative largely favored a simple framing: a son gone rogue, a father tragically victimized, a family torn apart by inexplicable violence. But simplicity is rarely the truth in families, and the Maid's account forces us to confront that complexity. She describes, in vivid detail, moments in the Reiner household that suggest a long-running cycle of tension, emotional abuse, and manipulation. She recalls times when she heard Nick crying in his room and Rob responding with criticism, sarcasm, or outright blame toward Michelle, framing her as too soft or unable to control him. According to her, these were not isolated incidents, but recurring patterns, small fractures in a household whose public image suggested unity, respect, and love. Imagine for a moment the psychological weight of living in a house like this. Imagine a child repeatedly made to feel wrong for expressing pain. Imagine a spouse gaslit by someone she trusted, made to internalize blame for a partner's cruelty. And imagine being a witness to it all, forced into silence because speaking up could risk your livelihood, your credibility, or worse, being disbelieved. That is the context the Maid claims she endured, silently observing and bearing witness to a private life that clashed violently with the public one. It's important to pause here and reflect on why her account matters. Because in the weeks following the Reiners' deaths, much of the conversation focused exclusively on Nick, the alleged murderer, the troubled son, the headline villain. Almost no attention was given to the day-to-day dynamics that might have shaped his behavior or the environment in which fear, anger, and resentment grew. The Maid's testimony, if accurate, reframes the narrative not to excuse violence, but to highlight that tragedy rarely emerges from a vacuum. Her story also challenges the comforting narrative of victimhood that society often clings to. It's easier to say that Rob Reiner, a respected filmmaker, was purely a victim of his son's rage. It's easier to fit him into a mold of goodness and assign evil to the accused. But families are messy, fraught with contradictions, and often a mix of love, fear, frustration, and misunderstanding. And in this household, the Maid says, that mix tipped into something dangerous long before the events that shocked the world. Even as the public mourned, Even as social media erupted with tributes and disbelief, she remained silent. She watched friends, colleagues, and strangers assign blame, debate motive, and construct theories, while she carried her own knowledge in private. Why? Because revealing it would have made her complicit in breaking trust, in challenging powerful figures, in becoming part of a story she was unprepared to navigate publicly. But now, she says, the magnitude of the tragedy compels her to speak. She says that understanding the full story, understanding what happened inside that house, is necessary not just for history, but for the lessons it might offer about families, power, and the hidden fractures that can erupt in violence. The tension in her account lies not just in the alleged cruelty, but in the contradictions. Here is a man the world revered, someone capable of creating art that resonated with millions, yet allegedly capable of moments of harshness behind closed doors. How does one reconcile such duality? How does a household balance affection and fear? And how much of what is remembered, repeated, or reported is shaped by public perception rather than lived experience? To understand her story fully, one must consider the environment of the Reiner household. A sprawling Brentwood estate, meticulously maintained, polished for visitors, cameras, and parties. Yet behind the walls, she claims, a different reality played out. Quiet corridors, closed doors, the muffled sounds of a child trying to escape criticism, a mother striving to maintain peace in the face of relentless tension. These details are subtle, but they accumulate into a portrait of a household that was, according to her, riddled with emotional pressure points. The maid recalls one incident in particular, a moment she says she can never forget. It involved Nick crying in his room, Rob's frustration escalating, and Michelle attempting to mediate. In the span of a few minutes, she claims, she witnessed a full pattern of behavior. A child expressing fear, a parent dismissing it, another parent blamed, and an atmosphere of silent tension enveloping the house. She left that room shaken, uncertain if she should intervene, and terrified of what might happen if she spoke. It is moments like these, she says, that reveal the undercurrents of dysfunction that ultimately culminated in tragedy. And this is what makes her account both compelling and controversial. It does not absolve anyone of responsibility. It does not attempt to justify the violence that ended Rob and Michelle's lives. What it does is provide context, a framework to understand that tragedy is often the result of patterns that are ignored, minimized, or hidden for years. It suggests that narratives of heroism and villainy are incomplete, that real life exists in shades of gray, and that those shades are often invisible to the public eye until catastrophe strikes. As the world debates what happened that fateful night, the maid's voice adds another layer. The day-to-day reality of living in a household that, beneath its public veneer, might have been fraught with emotional turbulence. Her account asks viewers to consider not just the final act of violence, but the cumulative impact of years of tension, criticism, blame, and fear. It asks difficult questions. How do we define responsibility? How do we recognize patterns of harm before they escalate? And how do we reconcile public personas with private behaviors? Her story is a reminder that tragedy is rarely instantaneous. It is the product of accumulated moments, small, seemingly inconsequential acts that, over time, shape the people who live through them. The tears in Nick's room, the whispered disagreements, the silent observations of someone tasked with keeping the household running. All of these, she says, were threads in a tapestry that eventually unraveled in the most horrifying way. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we process allegations that challenge a widely held perception of a beloved public figure? How do we hold space for grief, for anger, and for the complex realities of human behavior? These are the questions that will guide this narrative as we explore the maid's account, the events leading up to the deaths, and the patterns that some say went unnoticed for far too long. And yet, even as we begin this exploration, there is one detail that cannot be ignored, a single moment that, according to the maid, changed her perception of the entire family forever. It was a fleeting instant in a quiet hallway, a child's tear, a parent's scolding, and a mother's attempt to mediate, all witnessed by someone who felt powerless to intervene. That moment, small and seemingly insignificant, she says, revealed the true nature of the household. A house built on tension, fear, and unspoken grievances, where appearances masked deep and persistent dysfunction. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. If you only knew Rob Reiner through interviews, you'd think you knew him completely. The man who directed films that made audiences laugh, cry, and reflect on life's moral puzzles seemed, in public, larger than life. Confident, articulate, principled. A Hollywood icon whose name alone commanded respect. He spoke of empathy, of family values, of social justice, and people believed him because he appeared consistent, genuine, untouchable. But public personas are designed to be seen, curated to be consumed. They are stories we are allowed to hear, carefully edited versions of reality that rarely tell the whole truth. And according to the maid who worked for him, the story inside his home was a very different one. For decades, Rob Reiner's reputation in Hollywood was that of a storyteller, a visionary. He directed films that have become cultural landmarks, movies that dissect human behavior with both humor and insight. In interviews, he smiled easily, laughed at the right moments, and seemed to radiate warmth. Colleagues described him as approachable, witty, intelligent, a man who could charm a room while guiding cast and crew with clear authority. Fans admired him not just for his craft, but for the moral clarity he projected, someone who could balance ambition with compassion, power with restraint. And yet, what is public perception but a mask? What the world saw was polished, rehearsed, refined. The man people cheered for on talk shows, award stages, and red carpets was, according to someone who lived within the walls of his home, not the full picture. The maid recalls that behind the cameras, behind closed doors, Rob was controlling in ways that were subtle but persistent, manipulative in ways that were almost invisible to outsiders. He would smile for the world, yet demand perfection in the smallest details at home, creating tension in ways that left his family constantly on edge. The contrast is jarring. On one hand, a celebrated filmmaker whose every word in public seemed guided by integrity and insight. On the other, a man whose private behavior, if the maid's allegations are accurate, involved belittling his son, manipulating his wife, and creating a household charged with emotional volatility. To reconcile these two images is difficult, because the human mind craves coherence. We want heroes to be wholly heroic and villains to be wholly evil. But reality rarely conforms to that simplicity. Families are messy, layered with love, fear, resentment, and unspoken expectations. And sometimes, the masks we wear publicly are the opposite of the truths we harbor privately. The maid's account begins not with violence or outright abuse, but with patterns, small, seemingly mundane behaviors that accumulate into something larger over time. She recalls a household that was meticulously ordered, where everything had its place and everyone had to follow the unspoken rules. The public could never see it. The corridors of the Reiner estate were polished, the gardens immaculate, the guest house serene. But inside the home itself, the atmosphere was tense, unpredictable, and charged with a quiet form of control. She remembers Rob's interactions with his son, Nick, as particularly revealing. In public, Nick might have seemed a normal young man, perhaps even privileged or spoiled. But behind closed doors, according to the maid, the dynamic was very different. She says she often saw Nick attempt to speak or express emotion, only to be interrupted, criticized, or dismissed. And when the child cried, not because of wrongdoing, but out of fear or frustration, Rob allegedly redirected that blame onto Michelle, painting her as too soft or incapable of enforcing discipline. What makes this account compelling is its focus on repetition. It wasn't a single argument, a single explosive incident. The maid describes years of subtle coercion, emotional manipulation, and family tension that coalesced into a charged environment, one in which Nick's behavior was continually framed as the problem while underlying dynamics were ignored. She recalls moments where she wanted to intervene, but felt powerless, fearful of speaking up, and acutely aware of the hierarchy within the household. This sense of helplessness, she says, shaped her perception of the family and of the unfolding tragedy in ways that no one outside could understand. It is worth pausing to consider why such accounts are often dismissed or overlooked. Celebrity culture creates narratives that are difficult to penetrate. We want to believe in heroes and villains, in simple moral binaries. When someone like Rob Reiner dies tragically, the natural inclination is to elevate him, to mourn him as a figure of goodness and talent, and to assign blame externally. Rarely do we interrogate the private dynamics that might have contributed to conflict or tragedy. And yet, those private dynamics, according to the Maid, were consistent, patterned, and undeniable. Her descriptions of Rob's behavior are nuanced. He was not portrayed as overtly violent in the physical sense, but controlling in emotional and psychological ways. She recalls the way he monitored interactions, the sharpness of his criticism, the subtle ways he would assert authority and create guilt. She describes a man who demanded attention, who expected compliance, and who did not hesitate to redirect blame when situations became uncomfortable. For those outside the home, these behaviors might have been invisible, or they might have been rationalized as parenting or managerial decisions. But for those who lived within that environment, the impact was profound, cumulative, and emotionally exhausting. The Maid also highlights the duality of his character, a tension that is central to understanding the household dynamic. Rob Reiner, the public figure, was witty, thoughtful, and admired for his insight into human behavior. Rob Reiner, the private figure, according to her, could be cold, dismissive, and quick to assign blame. This duality is not uncommon among public figures. In fact, it is almost expected in high-profile households where appearances matter as much as reality. But what makes her account particularly striking is the specificity of her observations. The exact ways in which this duality manifested in daily life, the repeated incidents that cumulatively shaped her understanding of the family dynamic, and the moments she identifies as tipping points that defined the household atmosphere. For instance, she recalls seeing Rob critique Nick for expressing vulnerability, only to blame Michelle for failing to control him. She describes the careful monitoring of minor mistakes, the sarcastic comments under the guise of humor, and the quiet but persistent emotional pressure that filled the home. These behaviors, she says, were consistent over time, creating an environment in which fear, self-doubt, and tension became normalized. The public narrative, by contrast, portrayed a loving, functional family, a portrayal she says was misleading and incomplete. Her account also emphasizes the psychological strain that comes from being in a household dominated by such duality. She recalls moments of anxiety, uncertainty, and moral conflict. Should she speak up? Should she remain silent? What were the consequences of either choice? Her narrative captures not just the behavior of Rob Reiner, but the ripple effects on everyone in the household. A son whose emotions were constantly policed, a mother navigating a husband's criticism, and a staff member forced to witness and interpret these dynamics while remaining silent. And then there is the larger cultural context. Hollywood is a world where perception is everything. The way a figure is seen publicly can influence careers, media narratives, and personal reputations. This creates a form of protective armor. Public personas are cultivated to manage perception, while private realities remain hidden. According to the Maid, this was precisely the case in the Reiner household, a veneer of respectability, charm, and wit masking tension, criticism, and emotional coercion. Understanding this duality is key to understanding the events that later unfolded, because appearances can be deceiving, and the truth behind closed doors is often far more complicated than the narrative presented to the public. Despite the shocking contrast between public image and alleged private behavior, it is important to note the Maid does not claim that Rob Reiner was wholly malevolent. Her account presents a man with complexity, contradictions, and flaws. A man whose brilliance and public charm coexisted with private behaviors that were controlling and, at times, hurtful. This nuance is essential. It challenges the simplistic dichotomy of victim and perpetrator, suggesting instead a web of relationships and behaviors that were fraught with tension long before tragedy struck. Even as the public mourned the deaths of Rob and Michelle, she remained silent. She watched as media outlets constructed narratives, as social media erupted with speculation, and as everyone sought simple explanations. Her silence, she says, was not complicity but a reflection of fear, loyalty, and uncertainty. Speaking out earlier would have meant confronting powerful figures, challenging entrenched narratives and exposing herself to scrutiny. Now, however, the magnitude of the tragedy compelled her to speak, to offer a perspective that might complicate, enrich, and deepen our understanding of what happened inside the Reiner household. Her account asks uncomfortable questions. How do we reconcile public perception with private behavior? How do patterns of control and emotional manipulation shape children, spouses, and witnesses over time? How much do we ignore or rationalize because it conflicts with the image of someone we admire? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when these dynamics are left unchecked for decades, accumulating silently until something catastrophic occurs? Ultimately, this introduction is designed to establish the tension between appearance and reality, public and private personas, and the cumulative impact of repeated emotional dynamics. It is meant to challenge the audience, spark curiosity, and prepare them for a detailed exploration of events, behaviors, and patterns that are at once shocking, unsettling, and deeply human. But the most critical question looms. If the world only saw the public persona, what happens when the hidden truths are finally revealed? According to the Maid, the answer is a household shaped by fear, control, and emotional turbulence, and a story that leads inexorably to the tragedy that captured global attention. And the first glimpse of this hidden reality begins not with headlines, police reports, or public statements, but with the small, recurring moments that define the Reiner family behind closed doors. And what came next would reveal more than anyone outside could have imagined. The people who clean your house often know more than your friends. They see things that slip past casual observation. They witness arguments behind closed doors, notice patterns in behavior that others dismiss, and hear conversations meant to be private. And in the Reiner household, according to one former maid, she saw enough to alter how she understood the family forever. Her role began simply enough. She was hired to maintain the home, to keep the estate orderly, and to provide support where needed. The public sees her as a minor presence, a background figure in a story dominated by celebrities. But within the walls of that Brentwood mansion, she was a constant observer, someone who noticed the rhythms of life, the subtle tensions, and the moments of strain that no one else recorded. Over time, her awareness deepened. She began to see patterns, to anticipate arguments before they erupted, and to recognize the emotional temperature of the household at any given moment. According to her, the Reiner home was both glamorous and meticulously maintained. Visitors were greeted with polished floors, perfectly arranged furniture, and a sense of order that suggested calm and control. But beneath that surface, she says, the reality was far messier. The corridors were often silent in a tense way, the quiet punctuated by muffled voices, sighs, or the occasional slam of a door. She describes the atmosphere as charged, a place where every action was weighed, observed, and sometimes judged. For those who only saw the exterior, it was a picture-perfect household. For her, it was a web of small but consequential dynamics that shaped the lives of everyone inside. Her proximity to the family gave her a perspective few others had. She was there when Nick cried, when Michelle tried to mediate, and when Rob's criticisms escalated beyond casual discipline. She saw moments that, to outsiders, might have seemed trivial or easily dismissed, but to her revealed patterns of control, blame, and emotional tension. She witnessed the ways in which Rob's frustrations were redirected, often onto Michelle, and how the atmosphere could shift in an instant from calm to charged. One of the most striking aspects of her account is the sense of fear that permeated the home. Not fear of violence, per se, but fear of displeasing, of being criticized, of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. She recalls that even minor mistakes could trigger sharp responses. A misplaced object, a delayed task, or an unguarded comment might result in scolding, sarcasm, or implied blame. She describes the emotional weight of walking through the house, constantly alert to the reactions of the adults, acutely aware of the invisible rules that govern behavior. Her narrative emphasizes that this environment was not static. It shifted depending on mood, context, and circumstance. Some days were calm, almost normal, with laughter and conversation flowing freely. Other days, tension thickened the air, leaving her feeling anxious and hyper-aware of every word she spoke and every task she performed. She describes this variability as exhausting, a constant balancing act in which she was both participant and witness. She also recalls observing Rob's interactions with Nick in particular. She describes a complex dynamic. A father who could be demanding, critical, and at times dismissive, paired with a son who was sensitive, frustrated, and often caught in the middle. She says that while outsiders might have interpreted Nick's behavior as rebellion or misbehavior, the underlying reality was far more nuanced. The way Rob expressed frustration, through criticism, sarcasm, or redirected blame, contributed to an ongoing cycle of tension and emotional strain. Michelle's role in this dynamic was also significant, according to the Maid. She portrays Michelle as a woman attempting to maintain peace, often caught between her husband's expectations and her son's needs. Michelle's efforts to mediate, to soothe, and to manage the household were constantly challenged by Rob's criticisms. The Maid says that this created a situation in which Michelle was blamed for problems she did not create, a pattern of emotional triangulation that reinforced tension in the home. The Maid's perspective also highlights the difficulty of observing without intervening. She was in a position of authority over the household's physical maintenance, but had little power to influence interpersonal dynamics. Speaking out could have jeopardized her employment, risked disbelief, or even placed her in conflict with a family whose social and professional influence was significant. She describes the moral conflict of witnessing distress and feeling powerless to act, a tension that weighed heavily on her over the years. What sets her account apart is not just what she claims to have seen, but how she interprets it. She does not reduce the family to caricatures of villainy or innocence. Instead, she portrays a household shaped by patterns, by repeated behaviors, by cycles of control and response that ultimately define the emotional climate. She describes Rob as charismatic and accomplished in public, but controlling and at times harsh in private. She describes Michelle as loving, patient, and mediating, yet constantly blamed and criticized. She describes Nick as sensitive and reactive, but caught in dynamics over which he had little control. Together, these elements formed a complex system, a household whose dysfunction was subtle but persistent. Her narrative also touches on the psychological effects of living in such an environment. She describes the ways in which tension affected behavior, how constant vigilance and emotional regulation became necessary survival mechanisms. She recalls observing Nick withdraw, become frustrated, or cry, and noticing how these responses were framed as problems by Rob rather than signals of distress. She also describes how Michelle internalized blame, navigating a husband's criticism while attempting to protect her son. These dynamics, she says, were invisible to outsiders but highly consequential for the emotional life of the household. The Maid emphasizes that her account is based on repeated observations over time, not a single incident or outburst. She says that patterns reveal themselves through consistency, through the accumulation of moments that, individually, may seem minor but collectively shape experience. Walking through the Reiner home day after day, she says, she began to see these patterns clearly. The way criticism followed expressions of vulnerability, the way blame was redirected, the way tension fluctuated and persisted. She also describes the psychological burden of being a witness. She says that over the years, she felt conflicted, anxious, and isolated. She was responsible for the maintenance of the home, yet she carried knowledge of private tensions that she could not discuss. She describes the constant balancing act of performing her duties while observing the undercurrents of emotional conflict, the strain of seeing distress and feeling powerless to intervene. And yet, despite the challenges, she remained present, witnessing, recording in memory the details of daily life. Her proximity allowed her to observe what outsiders could not: the small gestures, the tone of voice, the subtle shifts in mood that revealed the underlying emotional climate. She recalls moments when a glance, a sigh, or a raised voice could alter the atmosphere of a room, moments that were invisible to the public eye but highly significant for those who lived them. She also notes the irony of public perception. The Reiners were seen as a polished, accomplished, and successful family. But in private, she says, the emotional experience was far more complicated. Her account challenges the assumption that public success equates to private harmony, emphasizing that the lives of families, even those in the public eye, are shaped by patterns, tensions, and behaviors that remain hidden from view. The maid's observations extend to the way conflict was managed or not managed within the home. She describes an environment in which disagreements could escalate subtly but persistently, creating ongoing stress. Criticism was often indirect, humor was used to mask irritation, and tension was channeled in ways that reinforced emotional strain. She emphasizes that these behaviors were not always dramatic or explosive, but they were consistent and meaningful, shaping the experiences of everyone in the household over time. What ultimately compelled her to speak, she says, is the combination of tragedy and timing. The deaths of Rob and Michelle, the arrest of Nick, and the public narratives that quickly formed left her with a sense of urgency. She felt that the story being told, one that simplified the dynamics into a clear victim and villain, was incomplete. Her account, she believes, provides necessary context, insight into patterns of behavior, and a perspective on the emotional life of the household that is otherwise invisible. In describing her decision to speak out, she emphasizes both courage and risk. Speaking meant challenging powerful figures, risking disbelief, and entering the glare of public attention. But the weight of years of observation, the sense that the full story mattered, and the desire to provide perspective outweighed her fear. She felt compelled to ensure that the narrative surrounding the Reiners acknowledged complexity, nuance, and the patterns that shaped their lives. The Maid story is a reminder that the people who serve in households often have unique insight. They see things that others overlook, hear things that others dismiss, and understand the subtle rhythms of daily life. In the Reiner household, she says, this insight revealed an environment of tension, control, and emotional complexity. She observed, she remembered, and now she speaks. And as we move deeper into the story, the details she provides will challenge assumptions, reveal contradictions, and force us to reconsider what we thought we knew about a family that has been defined in public memory by tragedy, reputation, and headlines. But what she claims she saw one afternoon in the hallway, a single, fleeting moment, would haunt her for years, and it would be the first glimpse of a household dynamic that no one outside could have imagined. Children don't cry because they're weak. They cry because something overwhelms them, something bigger than their ability to cope, something they cannot control. And according to the maid who worked in the Reiner household, she saw Nick Reiner cry, and what happened next left her speechless, frozen, and questioning everything she thought she knew about the family. It was an ordinary afternoon, she says, the kind of quiet day that makes the subtle undercurrents of a household all the more noticeable. Rob was upstairs in his study, immersed in his work. Michelle was moving quietly through the kitchen, attending to routine tasks. And Nick, who had spent the morning attempting homework and creative projects, retreated to his room, frustrated by the relentless expectations that seemed to shadow every aspect of his life. The first thing she noticed, from the hallway outside his room, was a quiet sobbing, soft at first, almost imperceptible. It was the kind of sound that could easily be mistaken for frustration or fatigue, but her years of experience in the household told her it was more than that. She paused, listening, recognizing the pattern. Nick crying in response not to punishment, but to emotional pressure he could not escape. What followed, she says, was something she would never forget. Rob entered the room, his demeanor calm, almost casual, but the tension beneath it was palpable. He spoke firmly, with a measured voice, yet every word carried the weight of authority and judgment. He asked Nick what was wrong. The child's answer was hesitant, full of self-doubt, and in response, Rob criticized him, not for an action, not for misbehavior, but for expressing emotion itself. She remembers the exact phrasing, or at least the essence. "You're letting this get to you too easily," he said. "Why can't you handle things like everyone else?" The words were designed to minimize, to shame, to communicate that vulnerability was unacceptable. To an outsider, this may have sounded like parenting, a push for resilience. To her, it was emotional pressure that compounded a child's existing stress. Nick's response was immediate and visible. His tears increased. His body tensed. His voice wavered. And then, according to the maid, Michelle entered the room, attempting to intervene, to soften the criticism, to mediate. She tried to explain that expressing feelings was natural, that everyone has moments of frustration, that Nick was not failing or weak. Rob's response, the maid says, was to redirect the blame. Michelle, in his view, was too soft, incapable of enforcing the discipline he believed necessary. He positioned himself as the authority, positioning her as the problem. He suggested that Nick's inability to manage his emotions was the result of her leniency, rather than a reflection of the natural pressures of growing up in a demanding environment. The maid recalls feeling a tight knot in her stomach. She had seen these interactions before, countless times, over months and years. She knew the patterns, the way Rob could dismiss vulnerability, the way Michelle's attempts to mediate were reframed as weakness. And she knew that Nick, already sensitive, was internalizing the criticism in ways that would shape his emotional world. It wasn't just the words that struck her. It was the tone, the pacing, the way Rob combined calmness with intensity. It was the quiet authority that left no room for pushback, no space for error. The maid describes a sense of invisibility, of being trapped in a dynamic where every action is scrutinized, every response judged, and every expression of vulnerability reframed as failure. She also recalls the physical cues. Nick's hands trembled, his posture slumped, his voice faltered. Michelle moved closer, her tone gentle but firm, attempting to de-escalate the tension. But Rob, she says, maintained his position, unyielding, redirecting blame with precision. It was a masterclass in emotional control, or, as she perceived it, emotional coercion. What made the moment particularly striking, she says, was the cumulative effect of years of repeated interactions. This was not an isolated incident. It was one of countless instances in which Nick's emotions were policed, his responses evaluated, and his vulnerability treated as a flaw. And witnessing it, she says, left her with a deep sense of unease, a recognition that the dynamics at play were not healthy, that patterns of emotional strain were entrenched and persistent. The maid's narrative emphasizes that children are not equipped to navigate such sustained emotional pressure. They are sensitive to tone, nuance, and inconsistency. They absorb blame, internalize criticism, and often feel responsible for conflicts they did not create. She saw Nick experience this pattern repeatedly, each instance reinforcing feelings of inadequacy, frustration, and fear. And in that moment, one afternoon in a quiet hallway, the full weight of these dynamics became visible. She also points out the irony and tragedy of public perception. Outsiders might have assumed the Reiners were a typical, even idyllic, family. Rob was celebrated, Michelle admired. Nick assumed to be the troubled or privileged son. But in reality, the maid says, the emotional landscape was complex, charged, and fraught with tension. The quiet sobs, the redirected blame, the attempts at mediation, these were invisible to the world, yet central to the lived experience of the family. What makes her account credible, she says, is repetition and observation. She did not see one isolated incident. She saw patterns, behaviors that repeated over time, behaviors that shaped the emotional climate and influenced everyone in the household. She saw how criticism was delivered, how blame was redirected, how tension escalated and subsided, and how children and parents navigated these dynamics in real time. And yet, she remained silent for years. The reasons were complex: fear of retaliation, professional loyalty, social dynamics, and the difficulty of being believed. She describes the inner conflict of wanting to intervene, but recognizing the limits of her position. She saw distress, she saw imbalance, and she felt powerless to change it. It was a heavy burden, one that shaped her perspective on the family and on the eventual tragedy that would unfold. Her observations also shed light on the long-term psychological effects of such interactions. She saw a child's confidence erode, self-doubt increase, and frustration accumulate. She noticed the subtle ways in which repeated criticism could shape behavior, influence choices, and create a persistent sense of insecurity. The maid's perspective is that these small, repeated moments, so easily dismissed by outsiders, were critical to understanding the broader context of the Reiner family dynamics. This chapter of her account is central because it underscores the tension between vulnerability and authority, between expression and judgment. It highlights how emotional coercion can be subtle, persistent, and damaging, and it raises uncomfortable questions about responsibility, perception, and the impact of repeated patterns on family members who are, in many ways, powerless to escape them. The Maid also reflects on the moral ambiguity of the moment. She does not portray Rob as purely evil, nor Nick as purely victimized. Instead, she presents a household shaped by complex interactions, where love, fear, frustration, and misunderstanding coexisted. She emphasizes that understanding these dynamics does not excuse violence. It contextualizes behavior, highlights patterns, and provides insight into the pressures that existed long before the tragedy made headlines. Even as she recounts this moment, she stresses the lasting impression it left. Seeing a child cry, witnessing the redirection of blame, observing the tension between parents. It was a snapshot of the family system, a microcosm of broader dynamics that had been unfolding for years. And it was a moment that would stay with her, haunting her perception of the household and influencing her decision to speak out years later. But just when it seemed the afternoon had settled into uneasy calm, the Maid recalls, the situation escalated in ways she could not have predicted. Rob's next words, Michelle's reaction, and Nick's response created a chain of events that would leave an indelible mark on her memory and serve as a glimpse into the ongoing patterns that define the household. What came next would challenge her assumptions about authority, blame, and family, and set the stage for a series of events that few outside the home could have foreseen. Every home has its rhythm, its flow, its invisible architecture of human interaction. Some homes hum with laughter, with ease, with the quiet sense that people feel safe and understood. Other homes hum differently. A tension beneath the surface, a quiet anxiety threaded through daily routines, small but constant pressures that shape the way everyone moves, speaks, and thinks. According to the maid who worked in the Reiner household, their home fell squarely into the latter category. She describes it as a house built on tension. Not tension that erupted dramatically every day, not arguments that shook the walls or slammed doors, but a more insidious, persistent form of pressure. It was the type that accumulates, that leaves invisible marks, that teaches inhabitants to anticipate conflict, to regulate themselves, to walk on eggshells without ever acknowledging the fragility beneath. For years, she says, this tension was present in every corner of the mansion, from the polished living room where guests were welcomed to the quiet hallways where minor disputes were quietly resolved, redirected, or reframed. The maid's observations began with routine household duties, but she quickly realized that the physical spaces were inseparable from the emotional dynamics they contained. The kitchen, she recalls, was often quiet but tense, as though the walls themselves absorbed and reflected the moods of the occupants. The living room, she says, was polished and perfect for appearances, but conversations there were carefully moderated, emotions measured, and mistakes, even minor ones, noticed and remembered. The bedrooms, particularly Nick's, were spaces of vulnerability, where feelings could surface but were constantly monitored, judged, or reframed. According to her, the tension was a result of multiple, intersecting dynamics. Rob's precise, controlling behavior set a tone that left little room for error. Michelle's attempts to mediate and nurture were consistently reframed as weakness. And Nick, as the son of this carefully balanced but fraught system, absorbed the pressures from both directions. What outsiders saw as a normal family life, arguments, disagreements, expressions of frustration, was in reality a carefully choreographed struggle, a pattern of influence, criticism, and emotional navigation that shaped the daily existence of everyone involved. She describes walking through the house and feeling the weight of unspoken expectations. Every step, she says, was measured, every action scrutinized, even unconsciously. Minor infractions. A dish left out of place, a towel not folded correctly, a word spoken at the wrong moment, could ripple through the atmosphere, producing tension, subtle criticism, or redirected blame. Over time, this created a pervasive sense of vigilance, an internalized monitoring of behavior that left everyone on edge, unsure if their actions would be deemed acceptable or wrong. The maid emphasizes that the tension was not always visible or explosive, but it was cumulative. It shaped moods, dictated interactions, and influenced decision-making. Nick's sensitivity, she says, was heightened by years of subtle criticism and redirected blame. Michelle's patience was tested constantly by the emotional demands of both her husband and her son. And she herself, as a witness and participant in household routines, became hyper-aware, measuring her movements, words, and responses to avoid inadvertently triggering conflict. What made the environment particularly challenging, she notes, was the subtle interplay between control and charm. Rob could be charismatic, witty, and engaging in public, and even in private, he had moments of warmth. These glimpses of affection or levity, however, were often interspersed with subtle forms of manipulation or criticism. The Maid describes a pattern in which kindness and criticism were paired in ways that kept everyone uncertain, maintaining control while preventing outright rebellion. It was, she says, a carefully balanced tension designed to sustain authority while masking its more coercive elements. She recalls one particularly telling example involving a household gathering. Rob was preparing for a dinner party, and the family was moving through routines that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. Nick attempted to contribute to the preparations, expressing suggestions and ideas. Michelle intervened gently to guide him, supporting his engagement and encouraging him to participate. Rob, observing the interaction, praised the effort briefly, then criticized small deviations from his expectations. Michelle's guidance was framed as indulgence, Nick's contributions as flawed. The atmosphere shifted imperceptibly, creating a sense of discomfort, self-consciousness, and unease that lingered long after the dinner ended. The Maid points out that these micro-interactions were repeated countless times over years. The cumulative effect, she says, was a household in which tension was constant, trust was conditional, and emotional expression was carefully regulated. Each individual adapted in different ways. Nick internalized feelings of inadequacy. Michelle attempted to mediate while absorbing blame, and she herself became an observer and recorder of these dynamics, recognizing patterns that no outsider could perceive. She also reflects on the long-term impact of this environment. Children growing up in homes dominated by subtle tension learn to navigate conflict carefully, to anticipate reactions, and to manage emotions with precision. This creates skills, yes, but it also fosters anxiety, self-doubt, and hypervigilance. In the Reiner household, she says, these patterns were magnified by the public visibility of the family and the contrasting charm of Rob in professional and social contexts. The dissonance between public image and private experience, she argues, intensified the tension, leaving Nick and Michelle in a perpetual state of emotional negotiation. Another key element, according to the Maid, was the atmosphere of blame and redirection. She recalls multiple occasions when conflicts were not addressed at their source, but reframed in ways that shifted responsibility. Rob's frustrations were frequently projected onto Michelle. Minor mistakes or lapses were interpreted as systemic failures. This created a feedback loop in which tension increased, emotions were policed, and no one could feel fully safe in expressing themselves. Even the Maid, whose role was ostensibly neutral, felt the effects of this pattern, carefully moderating her behavior to avoid attracting criticism or disrupting the delicate equilibrium. The Maid emphasizes that the house itself became a reflection of these dynamics. Each room, she says, contained echoes of past arguments, gestures, and interventions. The corridors, hallways, and shared spaces held subtle reminders of tension, unspoken rules, and emotional negotiation. The very structure of the home, in her mind, was imbued with the pressures and patterns that defined life inside. Visitors could see beauty, order, and success, but the invisible architecture, the emotional landscape, was far more complex and fraught. This tension was also compounded by the duality of Rob's character. Publicly, he was charming, witty, and highly regarded. Privately, he was controlling, critical, and precise. Michelle attempted to balance these extremes, maintaining warmth and care while absorbing criticism and navigating her son's emotional needs. Nick, sensitive and perceptive, internalized the pressure, navigating both public expectation and private judgment. The maid's account emphasizes that this interplay created an environment in which tension was normalized, emotional regulation was essential, and vulnerability was a liability. She recalls that the tension extended into virtually every aspect of household life. Simple tasks, preparing meals, completing chores, or handling daily routines, became opportunities for subtle correction, criticism, or blame. Even gestures of affection or engagement could be misinterpreted or reframed. Over time, this created a household climate in which everyone was hyper-aware, emotionally vigilant, and constrained by the invisible rules imposed by Rob's control and the ongoing redirection of blame. Her narrative also highlights the psychological burden carried by everyone in the home. Nick's emotional responses were constantly scrutinized and reframed. Michelle's interventions were consistently undermined. And the maid herself experienced anxiety, moral conflict, and a sense of responsibility for observing without intervening. The cumulative effect, she argues, was an environment in which tension was omnipresent, shaping behavior, decisions, and emotional experience. And yet, there were moments of levity, moments that complicated the narrative. Rob's charm, wit, and occasional warmth provided relief, albeit temporary. Michelle's patience and care created pockets of stability. But these moments, she says, were always tinged with the underlying awareness of tension, the knowledge that criticism could return at any moment, and the persistent uncertainty that defined daily life in the house. The maid stresses that understanding the tension is crucial for contextualizing later events. This is not a story of overt abuse or dramatic conflict. It is a story of emotional architecture, subtle coercion, and the ways in which repeated, small interactions shape the lived experience of a household. It is in this tension, she says, that the seeds of later tragedy were sown, not through a single incident, but through years of patterned behavior that created pressure, anxiety, and emotional strain. And as she reflects on her time in the house, she recalls a moment that crystallized the pattern of tension most vividly. A simple interaction, a minor disagreement, a subtle shift in tone, all of it combined to reveal the underlying dynamics that shaped life for everyone inside. It was a glimpse into the invisible architecture of control, blame, and emotional regulation that defined the Reiner household, and one that foreshadowed the events that would later shock the world. But what happened during that particular moment, she says, would be the first sign of a fracture that no one outside the house could see. A fracture that would grow, deepen, and eventually culminate in tragedy. Human behavior is rarely random. Most of it is patterned, habitual, repeated in ways so subtle that only careful observation can reveal the underlying rhythm. In the Reiner household, the maid says, she saw these patterns everywhere. Interactions repeated, tensions cycling, blame redirected, and emotional responses accumulating over years. What may have seemed like isolated incidents from the outside were, in fact, part of a larger, persistent dynamic, a web of behavior that shaped the emotional climate and left long-term consequences for everyone involved. The first pattern she noticed was the policing of emotion. From Nick's earliest years, she recalls seeing his feelings constantly monitored. Small expressions of frustration, sadness, or fear were quickly met with criticism or redirection. Rob, in particular, would frame these reactions as flaws, signs of weakness, or failures to measure up to expectations. And when Nick expressed vulnerability, Michelle would often intervene, but her interventions were subtly undermined, reframed as softness or indulgence. Over time, the child learned that expressing emotion carried risk, that it would be judged or redirected, and that safety lay in suppression or careful self-regulation. The maid emphasizes that this pattern was subtle, almost invisible to outsiders. On the surface, the family could appear loving, functional, and even supportive. Public appearances, social gatherings, and interviews presented a carefully curated image. But inside, the repetition of criticism, redirection, and emotional monitoring created a household climate where fear, tension, and self-doubt became normalized. The walls themselves seemed to hum with the weight of unspoken expectations, a constant reminder that mistakes, feelings, and even curiosity could be scrutinized. Another pattern she observed was the cycle of blame. Rob, according to the maid, rarely acknowledged his own role in tension or conflict. Instead, he had a tendency to redirect frustration toward others, most often Michelle. If Nick struggled, if a disagreement escalated, if a task went awry, Michelle was often cast as the cause of the problem. She was framed as too soft, too lenient, too emotionally accommodating. This repetition created layers of psychological strain. Nick internalized blame for his emotions. Michelle absorbed responsibility for perceived shortcomings, and the household operated on a system where accountability was selectively applied. The maid also observed patterns in conflict escalation. Disagreements rarely erupted into chaos, but they followed predictable rhythms. A trigger, usually minor, would spark tension. Subtle criticism or sarcastic remarks would reinforce the pressure. Attempts at mediation would be reframed as complicity, and the cycle would repeat until equilibrium was temporarily restored. Each repetition reinforced behaviors, shaping the emotional responses of everyone involved. Over time, these cycles created a household in which vigilance, caution, and internalized tension were daily survival tools. She recalls that these patterns extended into everyday routines. Even mundane activities like preparing meals, folding laundry, or organizing the household were not neutral. Each action carried potential judgment. A towel not folded to exact specifications could result in subtle criticism. A dish left out of place could be reframed as carelessness or negligence. And these small, repeated incidents added up, reinforcing the invisible rules of behavior. Do not deviate, do not complain, and always anticipate authority. According to the maid, one of the most impactful patterns was the interplay of charm and control. Rob could be witty, engaging, and at times warm, especially in public or during moments of levity in private. But these moments of charm were often paired with criticism, subtle manipulation, or control. The cycle created uncertainty, leaving family members unsure of when kindness would be followed by judgment, when safety would give way to pressure, or when praise would transform into blame. The oscillation between warmth and criticism, she says, magnified the emotional stakes and reinforced patterns of vigilance. The maid also notes that these patterns were generational in impact. Nick, sensitive and perceptive, was shaped by repeated exposure to criticism, redirected blame, and emotional pressure. He learned to navigate conflict carefully, to internalize feelings, and to anticipate judgment. Michelle, in turn, was trained to mediate while absorbing fault, maintaining calm even as her efforts were reframed. And the maid herself became hyper-aware of the dynamics, observing, recording, and adjusting her own behavior to navigate the household safely. Every person in the house was, in essence, responding to the cumulative weight of patterned behavior. She highlights the subtlety of manipulation as a key factor. Rob rarely needed to raise his voice or act overtly aggressive. The patterns themselves carried authority. Criticism, sarcasm, and redirection became invisible levers of control, shaping the household rhythm without the need for dramatic confrontation. It was, she says, an invisible scaffolding of influence that guided behavior, reinforced compliance, and maintained dominance. The genius, or the cruelty, of the system lay in its repetition, its subtlety, and its invisibility to outsiders. One pattern that particularly haunted her was the emotional triangulation between Rob, Michelle, and Nick. When conflict arose, responsibility was never equally distributed. Blame was redirected. Tension was funneled toward the softer party, often Michelle. Nick internalized his own emotions, Michelle absorbed blame, and Rob maintained authority. This repeating triangle, she says, defined interactions over years, shaping both individual behavior and collective household climate. It also created layers of emotional stress that were cumulative and persistent, quietly building pressure over time. She also emphasizes the patterns of emotional suppression. Vulnerability was discouraged, sensitivity was treated as weakness, and attempts to express frustration or sadness were reframed as failings. Nick learned to anticipate reactions, to manage his internal state carefully, and to limit expression of feelings that might provoke criticism. Michelle, too, learned to modulate her emotions, to maintain composure while absorbing fault. These adaptations were necessary for survival within the household but left lasting psychological impact. According to the Maid, another recurring pattern was the selective recognition of behavior. Positive actions or attempts at mediation were noted, but often reframed or overshadowed by criticism or subtle judgment. Even achievements, she says, were sometimes twisted into evidence of indulgence, favoritism, or oversight. The effect was a continual state of tension, in which accomplishments were never fully acknowledged, mistakes were magnified, and emotional equilibrium was fragile and temporary. She recalls the long-term impact on the household dynamic. Years of repeated patterns created a rhythm that everyone unconsciously learned to navigate. Nick's confidence eroded, Michelle's patience was constantly tested, and the maid herself became an observer attuned to subtle cues, anticipating conflicts before they erupted. These behaviors became second nature, forming an intricate web of expectation, reaction, and adaptation that defined daily life. The Maid stresses that understanding these patterns is crucial for contextualizing the tragic events that later unfolded. It was not a single argument, a single incident, or a single failure of judgment that defined the household. It was the accumulation of repeated interactions, cycles of blame, emotional pressure, and behavioral reinforcement. These patterns, subtle but persistent, shaped the emotional lives of everyone in the house and created conditions in which tension and stress were normalized. And she notes a final, haunting pattern: the blending of public and private personas. Rob's charm, wit, and intelligence in public contrasted sharply with his subtle control and criticism in private. The discrepancy magnified the tension, creating a household in which appearances were carefully managed, but the emotional reality was fraught with pressure, fear, and hypervigilance. Outsiders could see success and polish. Insiders lived the consequences of a carefully maintained pattern of control. Even as she recalls these patterns, the Maid says she was struck by how easily they could be overlooked by outsiders. Friends, colleagues, and even neighbors could interact with the family and perceive warmth, charm, and normalcy. But she, with years of observation, saw the invisible architecture of tension, the repeating cycles, the redirection of blame, the policing of emotion that defined the household. It was an emotional ecosystem, meticulously maintained and profoundly impactful.